Today in RimWorld, we are going to be surviving as an ODST fire team. Of course, with all the proper weapons, armor, as well as resources that come along with that. We are going to be utilizing the Winston Wave Storyteller and mod, which I have actually never used before, so I'm kind of jumping into this blindly, although I am aware of how the wave systems work, sorta. To make sure things are extra difficult, our only enemy that is going to be attacking us with every wave is going to be the Flood. And in case you're unfamiliar with them, they're basically space zombies. Extremely dangerous and even more infectious. We only have 5 days before the first wave of them come, so we'd better get to work. A few last minute things though, we are going to have all research unlocked because, well, the planet is completely barren and we're not going to have any trade or anything with any other factions or any other factions coming onto the map that could help us with raids on occasion, things like that, so it kind of felt fair that we would at least know how to make everything. To begin, we are going to be building some steel armored walls and steel armored embrasures for our first line of defense, as well as a steel blast door. These obviously cost much more in terms of resources, but they're also much stronger. As you could probably guess, as with most extremely safe and fortified bases in RimWorld, we are going to be digging inside a small mountain for our little fortified home here. It's possible that this may become our home sweet home, or it may very well become our tomb. Boosting our defenses immediately, we built a solar powered generator. That way we could go about powering 2 military style turrets. Toss in a battery for backup power just in case they come at night, and I'm already feeling pretty confident about the first wave already. We had a rabid snow hare attempt to attack us, but we blasted it in the face with a shotgun, and things were a-okay. And in our final hours just before the wave, we were prepping ourselves for the worst to come. We had a hound form, a carrier form, and 2 infection forms. The infection forms are the most dangerous in melee combat, as if they were to scratch our skin, we could easily end up becoming infected. Thanks to our turrets and our embrasures, that was a non-issue. After killing the hound form and the infection forms, we went out to finish off the carrier, and, well, we were done, shockingly. We apparently get to pick out a reward after every successful raid that we survive, which was pretty cool. So this time I decided to go with weapons, as I thought that would be the most useful. We received a gravity hammer, a sniper rifle, and a plasma rifle, which was perfect because plasma weaponry works great against the Flood since they are susceptible to fire. We were also butchering the hound forms and other forms that we could of the Flood because it would give us spores, which were actually worth a pretty penny. Not that we have any factions to trade with, but once we get an orbital trade beacon and a comms console, we could make some silver. As mentioned, I'm pretty unfamiliar with Winston Wave, so you could imagine my surprise when we didn't have 5 days again to prepare for the next raid, we only had 1. We need to get to work. We would expend some of our resources to go about building 2 more military-style turrets, as they came in very handy with the first wave. But defense is one thing. Ensuring that we don't have our soldiers having mental breaks and going crazy on this barren planet is another. So we need to ensure that we're actually giving them proper bedrooms and what have you in our mountain. And with that, wave 2 was underway. Although the attack was a bit underwhelming, if I can be honest with you. We easily finished off the infection forms and then also the carrier forms. This time around I chose yet another weapon drop, as the other 2 options didn't really seem all that useful. We ended up getting a pistol and something else I'd forgot. It wasn't that great. In between waves we finally ended up getting those bedrooms set up, though they still need quite a bit of work. It definitely beats sleeping out on the ground. Wave 3 eventually came and also went just as quickly. Things are going to start off quite slow, but I promise after a little while and a few more waves, it gets very intense. For our reward this time around, we decided to have another soldier join us here. It would be nice to see an unfamiliar face for once, and also to have a helping hand. Turned out to be a Sangheli, no doubt, one that is affiliated with the Swords of Sanghelios because, well, he's friendly and didn't try to stab us or shoot us, so I assume so. Either way, we were happy to have him, as he had his own plasma rifle and Sangheli really tend to be much faster and stronger than humans. Now that we have a helping hand, we're going to continue mining out our little fortification here and also collecting plenty of steel while we do so. Wave 4 would finally come, and as the rain came crashing down, as would our plasma blast and bullets upon the infectious flood. For our reward, we decided to go with just a random one, and this ended up being a lot of survival meals and medicine, which would come in handy, no doubt. Something else that was great about our new companion, though, you may notice that he works a lot at night while the rest of us sleep, and that is because he is a night owl, which is absolutely great because that means we're getting a lot of work done around the clock 24/7. Speaking of which, so that we didn't end up wasting any resources, we decided to smooth the walls and flooring inside of our little home here. Wave 5 came, and I wasn't all that impressed at first because it really seems like they're just ramping up the infection forms, which are pretty easy to kill. However, this raid also featured an orbital bombardment, so as the infection forms draw near and we began destroying them with our turrets and firepower in general, we also had many a missile raining down upon the region. It would seem maybe the flood has taken control of some type of bombardment satellite. I'm not really sure, but we did eventually end up winning this one, and we didn't get killed from any of the bombardments, thank God. I would once again end up choosing a random normal reward, which was pretty great as we ended up getting a few thousand silver, so once we do some trading, it'll be useful, I'm sure. We were doing even more mining as we planned on putting in a few extra bedrooms and also a new storage facility just a little to the northwest. Wave 6 was finally here, and the flood was actually preparing before its assault on the base, perhaps trying to plot a way around our defenses. But unfortunately, we also had some children who were coming to beg for medicine. The problem here is that the flood are always looking for some sort of biomass to take over, and, well, that's a shame. To be honest with you, I'm quite surprised that those children were even here. I suppose that does mean that there are other people on this planet somewhere. After defeating this wave, we ended up choosing yet another food drop. Now, technically, it might have been better for us to have an additional person, but I was afraid that if we had too many, we might not be able to feed them all. Since we're in a boreal forest, if we end up having a raid that doesn't have an offer of a food drop as a reward after a while, we could end up starving. We finally began working on our new storage room and even adding in an orbital trade beacon, though before we even had the chance to go about building our comms console, we had a cold snap set in at the end of the summer, when it's supposed to still be fairly warm, I would think, and this kind of touches back on us not being able to grow food. Wave 7 was finally here, and it was mostly just some more of the same, just a few more infection forms, easily destroyed. Our reward would end up being a prosthetics drop. Now, if the flood were to attack us, we're basically going to become infected, most likely, and turn into one, and there's no real way to replace an arm or anything that gets bitten fast enough, but we may be able to install a pain stopper or joy wire or something useful like that. We would eventually get that comms console finished up, and we were not doing so great on power. All these new machines and our heaters are sucking up a lot of electricity, which realistically I wouldn't mind, but we have Wave 8 coming right for us with many infection forms, and since we're having some power issues, this does mean that our turrets are going to be a little bit spotty at best. Once this raid was finally finished up, the next order of business was going to be collecting a random good reward instead of a random normal reward. So, as you might imagine, I was quite tickled to think of such a higher quality reward. Well, it was honor, which is absolutely useless because there's no empire on this planet. Womp womp. Well, with that disappointing reward out of the way, we actually began working on yet another solar-powered generator, and not only that, we would also deconstruct our old battery and swap it out for a much larger one. This way, when Wave 9 finally reared its ugly head, we didn't have to worry about our turrets kicking off mid-battle, and we only had to worry about rearming them. This time around, I chose cash as the reward. Though a tornado generator might be useful for most types of enemies, it would be something of a waste to use against a bunch of infection forms, I feel. Besides, with all this silver, we could go about doing some trading with an exotic goods trader who was finally in orbit around the planet, our very first trade ship, I might add. We would end up purchasing quite a few books, as it's been quite an ordeal trying to keep these folks from going batshit insane, and maybe reading a little bit will help keep them entertained. Something else I feel that will help out with that a lot is finally getting all of our flooring smooth, something that we've put on the back burner since we've been building turrets and power sources and yada yada. Wave 10 was here and we had an absolute shit ton of infection forms, nothing that we hadn't seen before, but as we were rushing outside to fight alongside our turrets, a solar flare ended up happening, meaning that even after building yet another solar-powered generator and a new battery, it didn't even matter at all for this raid as it was us against the world. Though we ended up destroying them quite easily, and even their carrier forms that came after. I once again decided to try my luck with a random normal reward, but I didn't see any reward fall from the sky, which I thought was quite odd. And also, if you haven't noticed, even after we get our rewards, because the carrier forms are separate from the infection forms, even though we complete the raid, we still have a few enemies to deal with. I just wanted to throw that in there. Anywho though, after all that combat, I would eventually find our reward. It turns out that we were given a ghoul who fell from orbit, and they look a little worse for wear, but I'm sure they'll come in handy somehow. I'm sure you've probably already guessed, but the issue with having a ghoul is they don't do any tasks such as, repairing our embrasures and walls like we're doing right now, and they're not very good at fighting, as melee combat is definitely going to get this ghoul infected and then basically killed. I mean, yeah. I do suppose they make for pretty cute pets, except she often likes to stand out in nature in the middle of the night and stare off into the distance. Okay, on the bright side, she was pretty easy to please as long as we had some fresh meat lying around on the floor, and if we don't feed her, she's basically a ticking time bomb, and we won't just have the flood to worry about. Wave 11 was finally here, and this is where things start to get interesting, as where most of our previous waves, except for I believe the first one, have basically been nothing but carrier forms and infection forms, we are now finally starting to see some combat forms such as the hounds. That, accompanied with the fact that there was going to be a meteor shower, meant that Wave 11 was going to be the most interesting thus far. We were being completely surrounded from all sides from the infection forms and even from the hounds, though I might have hyped them up a little bit too much as we quickly defeated them and the carrier forms. But this was simply foreshadowing for what was to come. I chose yet another food drop just to make sure we had a great big stockpile of it. Before Wave 12, I was noticing that some of the infected could end up taking cover behind some of the ancient debris and ruins in the area, so we went out and began destroying these old cars and stuff to ensure that that doesn't happen. And our pet ghoul went around and started cleaning up corpses by snacking on them. That's a good girl. Since we knew that she could eat these corpses and their rotted meat to sustain her own life, and of course we could butcher them for the spores to go about selling, we decided that we were actually going to build ourselves something of a freezer here to make sure that they don't rot too quickly. However, Wave 12 was finally here, and as you can see, it was gigantic. I was a bit confused as to why there were so many infected this time around, but apparently this is what's known as double trouble, meaning that there's twice as many enemies. But it wasn't just how many there were. There were new forms that we had yet to see, such as the stalker forms, which can become a ranged form. However, this does turn them into something of a turret, and even though they can attack from a distance, once they do it, it doesn't seem that they can maintain this form for very long, and since they were preparing before their attack, they basically wasted this. As the main group was preparing for the attack, I noticed that they were sending in small infection forms almost to scout out the base, or so I thought at first. But after a few of these, I noticed that our turrets were completely running dry on bullets. It seems that they knew exactly what they were doing, and we had been outsmarted by the parasite. Now, without our turrets, the only thing standing between us and this absolute onslaught of flood was going to be our own handheld weapons. Although we did leave one of our soldiers in the mines to try and get some steel to rearm our turrets as soon as possible. But as the enemies continued pouring around our defenses, I realized that the only true hope was to bring the soldier out of the mines and down to try to help us around the embrasures. At which point a hellish battle would continue into the early morning. And as the sun was beginning to come up over the horizon, a carrier would burst and throw infection forms right over our defenses. With our backs to the wall, the only thing that we could realistically do would be to retreat inside, and I'm glad we did when we did, because our defenses were finally beginning to fail. Our walls and embrasures had fallen, and these monstrosities were pouring through the holes. For a while, we had a second to catch our breath on the inside, as they were mainly focused with attacking our defenses like our turrets outside. But once they finally finished those off, they actually started attacking our walls and even setting fire to some of them somehow. Perhaps with their own gases? I don't know, or maybe the chem fuel from the turrets, somehow, but they were definitely burning our stuff. However, even so, I will say that we found this to be somewhat manageable. As they were attacking the stone walls that we had smoothed, we could easily repair those, keeping them out. For now. This would give us enough time to go back to where we were mining and actually mine out a small tunnel using the same steel, or to go about building a door just in case we need to make an escape. Since we have a way out and things seem fine, at least for the time being, I thought it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and start collecting more of this steel, as we are definitely going to need it to go about making more armored walls and embrasures. I was also keeping a close eye on our doors and walls to ensure that nothing bad happened while we were doing this, and eventually they would break through. They began rushing inside the mountain base and chasing us through our own corridors, but our ODST Shiar was actually being pinned down by the enemies. We all quickly rushed in to save him, but unfortunately we simply traded his place for our poor ghoul. With no way out, she was relentlessly bitten by the flood, and eventually she too was turned. We ended up locking ourselves in the hallway to begin tending to our wounds and to catch our breath for a moment. All this while the flood was tearing apart everything that we had built thus far. Now that we've regrouped, we'll have an opportunity to sneak out the back and come around the side to flank them, which is exactly what we decided to do. Now that there's some proper distance between us and these infection forms, there's very little chance of them getting close enough to us to actually infect us. Eventually, after many barrages of bullets and plasma, they were defeated. Realistically, none of the options were all that great for a reward, except for maybe the Psychic Soothe, but I thought that we might need steel a bit more, especially given the fact that everything we've built has been destroyed. Not to worry, I realize that the situation looks a bit grim, and of course we have lost our trusty ghoul, but we'll get back on our feet, I'm sure of it. Using much of the steel that we had already mined, as well as what we got with our reward for completing Wave 12, we finally threw together something of an acceptable defense to replace the previous one. You'll notice that I doubled up on the walls, and this is hopefully to try and prevent any carriers from slinging the infection forms over when they pop. I suppose that we'll see if this works, as it is now currently Wave 13. All was going pretty well at first. We were fending off all of the damn dirty flood that we could, and we were also rushing to get some steel, that way we could finally finish up our mini turret. It would definitely come in handy as the battle raged on all throughout the night. Though as we once again became surrounded by enemies, we were sorely missing our military-style turrets with their improved damage and fire rate. Into the early morning, we were finishing off what few stragglers of the carriers and infection forms that were left, and eventually we killed them small, but you may have noticed something there. Allow me to slow it down for you. Mid-combat, I accidentally ended up choosing our reward. Thankfully though, even though this was an accident, I ended up choosing to delay the next wave for 3 days, which was exactly what I would have chose anyhow. And now that we have a second to breathe, I thought it might be a good idea to step back and look at the bigger picture. Things are pretty rough at the moment, but we are rebuilding, and not only do we plan to survive here, but we plan on thriving here. Within the next 3 days before the next wave of flood come our way, we are going to rebuild this base bigger and better, starting off with some more armored steel walls that are actually going to be doubled up, just as our embrasures, for the exact same reasons: harder to penetrate and also harder to throw the infection forms over them. Next up, we are going to be fixing the interior portion of our little base with some proper bedrooms once more, as well as a place to cook, along with a butcher table inside a little freezer, as we had planned on doing before. We would also end up building a smelter in our cave system here. Since we keep getting drop pods with our rewards, that also means that we're getting plenty of steel slag chunks, and this will help us make our steel in total last as long as possible. And with that steel, we would end up building some barbed wire around our embrasures. Since the infection forms and other forms get very close during these raids, this will help us injure them, and with the infection forms case, it'll also end up popping many of them. We build a smelter to try and make our steel last as long as possible, but we're also going to be butchering some of the hound forms and removing the flood spores so that none of us get infected, of course, and we're going to be cooking the rotten meat of the host form into meals to make our current meals last longer as well. Is it ideal? No. Is it completely disgusting? Yes indeed it is, but sometimes you gotta get down and dirty to survive. But with that, it is time for us to face Wave 14, mostly comprised of hound, infection, and carrier forms, as well as a few stalker forms. Something that I had begun to notice is the fact that the infection forms can also bring back to life dead hound and combat forms, meaning that this is basically never ending. And what I mean by that is, even after we completely destroy all of the flood here, all of the enemies from Wave 14, if we don't destroy the corpses of these hounds, which is basically going to be impossible for us to do, and also to keep up with our defenses and turrets and everything like that, they are just going to keep reanimating their dead. Now, I will say something that made this process quite a bit easier is that after we had defeated all the enemies in Wave 14, we were able to request 3 new colonists join us here. Having 3 extra hands is more than useful, to say the least, essentially. The only thing was that we needed to arm them, of course. Luckily, we had quite a few weapons from the previous drop, so we should be good to go there. And this also makes me quite glad that we're actually cooking up that rotted meat along with our survival meals, because we also have 3 brand new mouths to feed, as you can see. We would end up digging out a few bedrooms for them just before Wave 15 rolled around. This wave was comprised of flood pure forms, which would immediately morph into mega tank forms, carriers, as well as different hives. Now, on the bright side, this was technically considered defeating the wave, and we could get our reward a bit early, but on the downside, this means that they are going to be constantly generating enemies for us to fight. So even once we defeat the initial raid and the combat forms and tank forms that are within it, which wasn't exactly easy, we are still going to have a constant flood, no pun intended, of enemies. Adding on to the severity, I noticed that wild animals like caribou were beginning to attack us as well, and that is because the hives that were forming were driving local wildlife insane. But clearing out the hives would not be an easy task. All of those moving little tentacle-looking arm things around the hives are each individually a turret that shoots extremely quickly. So naturally, we began to think that we would need more numbers and even better weaponry to go about defeating them. But as we were mining and planning out this attack, we had a tank form knocking at our back door, knocking it down, to say. Thankfully, most of our people were already in the mine, so it was quite easy to kill the tank form, but we had others trying to sneak in, so we would have to go out and fight them off as we rebuilt the door. Never a dull moment around here, also never a moment of peace it would seem nowadays, but anyhow, we finished off mining up plenty of steel within the mountain, and we ended up using this steel to build ourselves 2 new types of turrets, heavy turrets that is, firing much faster and much harder than the normal. They were much needed since we have never-ending waves of enemies at this point, and our ghoul enjoyed watching the carnage unfold late at night. And when I say never-ending waves of enemies, I'm not just talking about Winston waves anymore. I know I keep on saying that genuinely this battle is never-ending at this point, but I hope that this gives you some sort of reference. The map is completely flooded with flood. The next wave would finally show up, and it was more pure forms, morphing into hives and egg generators and tank forms and everything that we've already seen once more. For our reward this time around, we would once again request some weapons be dropped in, and though they were of poor quality, most of them were plasma and charge weapons, and that's exactly what we needed. As we were using our new weapons, we ended up receiving notification that a lone figure was approaching the colony. We decided to approach and try to save him before he was consumed alive. He was apparently some type of genius, a scientist of sorts. Well, one, we could definitely use someone with knowledge in different fields like this, and also we couldn't just leave him out here because he's almost definitely going to be infected or die. Welcome aboard, Doc. We'll be happy to have your services. Speaking of which, we would have the doctor here immediately begin helping us cleanse out one of these damn dirty hive infestations. This would be a battle of epic proportions as we were mowing down hordes of the flood, trying to make our way to the hive in the south part of the map. The only issue being, though, is that we were getting overwhelmed, and because of their turrets, we could barely do anything to try to stop them. We would have to try to flee, at least for the time being. As we were fleeing, though, our colonist Tiffy was getting pinned down by the infection forms, and eventually she too would join them. We ended up putting her out of her misery, though. Our mission to try and destroy these hives was a complete and utter failure. We would rush back to our base and lock the doors behind us. It would seem that we're going to need a lot more manpower and firepower before we can even attempt to try to stop these hives again. Otherwise, we'll be joining Tiffy a lot sooner than we would like. I'm not going to lie to you, things are looking a little bit more bleak nowadays, especially once Wave 17 arrived, and I noticed that there were combat forms, actual combat forms, in a humanoid shape, carrying plasma weapons, human weapons, and, well, I'm gonna be honest with you, I think we're dead. But even if there is a slim chance of survival, we are going to take it. We are completely out of steel, meaning that our turrets are going to be basically useless during this battle, and also we would have to resort to using silver to build our defenses. We already had many infection forms trying to tear through into our base. The only option to try to distract them would be for us to run outside of our defenses, and their hive mind would pick up on the fact that we were not inside and begin chasing us down. The only problem with this, the combat forms were well aware that we were coming out and immediately began attacking us. Once we ran back inside, they began turning around. It would seem they know exactly what they're doing, and they have us pinned down right where they want us. Later on into the night, the true battle would begin. Endless waves of the flood were coming straight for us. We were firing constantly and killing as many as humanly possible, mowing them down in large groups. But once they began using their own weapons against us, things were getting a little bit more difficult, to say the least. We started dropping people left and right, and we were trying to carry them inside to safety. They were absolutely relentless, and as they were beating on our walls, we would do the old tried and true method of coming out and trying to distract them. But this time around, it did not work out in our favor. Using a sentry laser, the Flood would even take out one of our ODSTs in their advanced armor. We continued to fight the good fight, trying to keep as much distance between us and the enemies as possible, and eventually the other ODST got back on his feet, picked up his weapon, and then he too was dropped once more. By this point, we were completely surrounded. Our ODST Liam was infected. With Liam down, our Sing Healy would be the last alive, and he too was surrounded and infected, I'm afraid. Now, technically, I should say some of the other members, such as Bogdan, our doctor, was still alive, as well as our other ODST. They were both just, bleeding out on the icy, frozen ground. And eventually, I did see that they tried to get back up, and they were both turned into Flood-infected combat forms. So, I think it's safe to say that we may have lost this one, unfortunately, but perhaps the victory is the friends that we made along the way? I don't know. Thanks for watching. Bye.